Welcome, my name is Ivan O'Gorman from IOG Bike Fitting Consulting. We're based here in Boulder, Colorado, and we have a bike fitting company and work with athletes on a daily basis. Getting into bike fit was kind of a love of the sport, and my background was working with a startup company that developed motion capture analysis, and I paired that with a knowledge of biomechanics and a love for the sport, and also working with multiple teams. And when I say teams, I mean generally around athletes. There can be physical therapists, physios, coaches, and so on. And through the kind of collaborative approach, we really have a very well-rounded knowledge and application of bike fit. Humans not being machines is something that we keep very much to the forefront of our decision making. You know, when it comes to making bike fit decisions for athletes, we have to consider a roadmap. And on that roadmap, we need to make some sound decisions. Yes, we take in some clinical rationale. Yes, we look at data, and we try to blend all of that. But any quality bike fit outcome is not driven purely on the basis of one ideology or one protocol. Technology plays a big role in what we do, and whilst we have an enormous amount of technology at our disposal, we over time have develop the experience and the knowledge to know when it's appropriate to use certain types of technology. So when it comes to some of the bike fitting decisions and choices that we make, we use different elements of technology. What a lot of you will be familiar with is motion capture, where we look at a lot of joint angles and how the athlete is positioned on the bike. But we have the capacity to look at pressure mapping. We can look at physiological aspects of bike fit, and there's more and more availability of mobile sensors where athletes can look at their movement out on the road. So data from technology is very important, but we need to know when to use it. Making decisions without technology and without the use of data just leaves a little bit more of an openness for grey area decision making. So what we like to do is we like to blend kind of like a trinity of decision making when it comes to bike fit. So you have the rider feedback, you have the data that you capture, and you also have the experience of the professional that the athlete is working with. And that's going to be very, very important. We like to try and blend to where all three are trying to achieve the goal for the rider. And I think experience and good use of that technology will help in achieving those goals. When it comes to fit flow, it kind of sets us up for success. So the first thing we need to do is we need to document the rider's initial position, and that's the bike. And we get that as a baseline. Then we need to learn about the rider. So we put them through a pre-fit assessment that allows us to understand the rider, their kind of quality of movement, some of their physiology, their limitations. Then we look at what they've been doing to date. We look at the contact points, their feet, the shoes, saddle, how the setup is. Put the rider on the bike and get some initial data. This allows us again to establish now the rider's baseline. So with the equipment baseline and the rider's movement baseline, we've got a very good and rounded view of how the athlete is currently riding. When we look at the data from that, we can then begin to look at what the more obvious approach or next steps are in the fit process. And they tend to be part of like a roadmap that we will create during the fit. And that roadmap is very much generated from what is the athlete's goals. So if the athlete's goals are to qualify for Kona, then we're looking at it more in relation to performance, but we're mindful of comfort, but we're also aware of sustainability. So keeping those kind of subtopics included in the decision making, we look at the position for where the most obvious opportunity is. In some cases, it's improving saddle comfort. In other cases, it's improving foot and pedal connection or evaluating crank length. In other cases, it may be more towards the leading edge of the bike, to where we're looking at aerodynamics, to where we're looking at how the rider's supported, to looking at how much stress the rider is under to hold a given position. So that's where a lot of the decision making takes place. Then we roll that out in a plan, and we put that plan over a period of time to where the rider can do qualified sessions, trialing out the changes that we've made. And it becomes a layering process. We build the position with the rider, and we keep what's working and we reevaluate what's not. And obviously we document each of those steps so that we understand the positional changes and the changes to the bike. Rider feedback is very important, but we need to kind of qualify it sometimes. What I mean by that is sometimes riders are very novice and they don't have a sense of feel. So when we talk to riders about saddle height, they may not be able to like hone in on exactly how it feels. Sometimes it's very common and it's fair that riders, when you make a change, will say, it feels different. I can't really tell if it's better or worse. It just feels different. So rider feedback has its place, but we also need to ensure that the fitter is experienced enough and that the data is helping to guide that. So we do like to have the buy-in from the rider, and it needs to be well explained to the rider what the changes that are taking place, what they're trying to achieve, so that the rider can take those changes into their training sessions and try and execute them. So playing some video for you here, what I want you to look at is just generally where the rider is above the pedal stroke, where they sit on the saddle, where the front end is. This example that you can see here is a highly competitive rider that rides at a world tour level. And you know, some of the fundamentals that this rider has can be shared by everyday rider. So let's take it back a little to the start and let's look at some of the key areas. At the top of the pedal stroke, what we're looking at here is knee flexion and hip angle closed. How much does this rider kind of, you know, how does the rider deal with over the top of the pedal stroke? For you guys watching this, we can talk about it in the context of fluency. Like, how fluent is the rider over the top? Because as you enter the top of the pedal stroke, you're entering the power phase. And what we want to try and do is access hip extension with the highest degree of speed and the lowest degree of, shall we say, hitch or dead spot. When we take them to the front of the pedal stroke, well, it's been well documented that the knee in relation to the foot is a critical fulcrum joint, and where we want to try and direct power in a very tangential sense into the crank. This is the part of the pedal stroke that is generally seen with the highest power application. So it's important that we position the rider from a fore-aft perspective as optimally as possible. When we come towards the bottom of the pedal stroke, what we're looking at this regard is the recovery phase. This is where the hip is extended to the point that the muscles have contracted, to where the quad muscles have contracted at the knee. And this is where the athlete begins to find recovery on the right side. Alternately, you can see that the left side is about to now apply force to the downstroke. So getting good knee extension is critical when we associate it with the muscles getting a recovery. And then if I want to just draw my cursor and take from hip to shoulder, what we're looking at here is a competitive torso or back angle, an angle that's associated with a lower kind of position, better for handling, better for racing, better for reducing an aerodynamic drag, but not for an everyday rider. But I want to give you this example because it is part of a high performance position. When we look at the gap between the rider's torso and their wrist, you can consider this as an armpit angle. What we're looking at here is a type of range that is giving the rider the availability to sprint, to get their body low in a breakaway, to lower their center of gravity when they're cornering, and to also, as some of you will know, move forward and back on the saddle as they access different muscle groups and as they change their center of mass in trying to maintain high power outputs. So this is what I would classify as a competitive position. It's rangy in the sense that it's a position where the rider will ride multiple postures within it. And I think it's a really good example of what I'd say a pretty gold standard position. So now that we've looked at like a positional review and using this example of a high performing athlete, let's kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about what an athlete's goals should be and what their roadmap should be as they enter their bike fit, no matter what their level of performance is. And let's talk about that next. So the importance of bike fit in relation to you, the athlete, will say in this context is, what's the rider history? What's the rider's goals? we need to understand if the rider has limitations, has things that we need to consider. We need to take those into account. Some of those limitations and some of the kind of availability of how that rider's position will look on the bike and what might be optimal for them can be generated by using a quick, or at least looking at some type of rider pre-fit assessment. At IOG, we have quite a kind of a long process to look at multiple ranges of motion so that we can really know as much as possible about the athlete before we make those decisions. Some of the key ones that I'd like you to focus on are, I'd like you to focus on the quality of squats that you can do, both double leg and single leg squat. I'd like you to think about the rider structure, as in, you know, are there previous injuries? Is there asymmetries from shoulders and hips and so forth? I'd like to see the rider walking. I'd like to see the rider doing a forward flexion evaluation. A lot of those key movements are associated in cycling. Forward flexion is associated with posterior chain length and how aggressive perhaps a position can be. Good quality squats can tell us a lot about hip flexion and the capability to generate good power from the hips. And then also knowing about the rider's general structure will help us when we consider quality of movement in a linear fashion or how they pedal on the bike. So these are some of the things that need to establish a baseline as the rider moves into making some bike fit decisions. Contact points. So moving into contact points, there are so many different rabbit holes I could go down here, but let's keep it simple and let's use the fit bike here in front of me as a way to go through those contact points. No better place to start than the saddle. The saddle is without doubt the foundation of a solid bike position. The impacts that a saddle has on a bike position are multiple. Let's talk about it in biomechanics. Where a rider sits on a saddle and where the saddle is obviously dictates where the rider is over the pedal stroke. So that's important to think about. The second thing that the saddle obviously has an impact on is general comfort. How satisfied is the rider on the saddle? And the rider needs to enjoy sitting on the saddle and needs to understand that they can sit in slightly different positions on the saddle without losing comfort. So I would say for anybody that's sitting on a saddle that feels they can't really move, you're limiting yourself largely in that capacity, and you need to look at some other saddle options. The third thing that saddles do is they allow either good movement and good posture. So can the rider rotate on the bike, and can the rider get into lower positions, whether it's crosswinds, whether it's generating higher power? The saddle is really key to whether they can get to that front end or whether they can get steeper over the pedal stroke. So that's the saddle. Let's move to what's going on at the crank. So crank length is a topic that a lot of people speak about, and crank length can be summarized by this. Crank length forces a range of motion at the knee. If the crank is too long, proportionate to the height of the rider, then it's going to force that rider into an excessive amount of range of motion, and one that doesn't necessarily yield any more power. It just means that at a given power, the rider is doing more work. So getting the crank length proportionate to the rider is important, and also factoring in crank length in relation to how aggressive a position is going to be important, because then we're taking into consideration knee flexion but also hip angle closed. So how acute the hip angle is at the top of the pedal stroke. We talked about that earlier in the importance of hitting the power phase with fluency. The pedal system and the feet, they need to be well engaged. The shoes need to obviously be very comfortable for the rider. They need to have nice adjustability so that riders can kind of dial that in. We always encourage good contact within the shoe, so suitable footbeds that help to distribute weight, not alone just in the ball of the foot but along the longitudinal arch as well. And good quality cleats, good quality pedal system. And then finally you come to the front end, and in a road position we're largely talking about the hoods. In a triathlon position we're talking about the arm pad, and we're talking about the aero extension, and how that impacts a rider's support and also a rider's posture. On the competitive end of things, riders are looking at aerodynamics. So in general, they're looking at how do they reduce their frontal surface area? How do they make their leading edge a little bit smaller and a little bit more aerodynamic? So they're areas that we go into obviously in very fine detail, depending what the goal of the riders are. That'll give you a summary of contact points, and I feel that until you have your contact points satisfied, that getting into some of the decision making in relation to where to put these contact points kind of becomes secondary. So get the contact points right first, and then begin to explore with positional changes after that. So now let's move a little to talk about equipment and its role within bike fit. So what I would say is equipment can either improve the kind of contact and the comfort, and sometimes it can improve the performance. So we spoke about it in relation to contact points, and first you heard me talk about equipment that will improve contact. After that, we can look at equipment that can improve performance. But it's safe to say that if a rider has a less than optimal position on very expensive and very aerodynamic equipment, that they're not going to ride well. We have to keep in mind that the rider is approximately 80% of the resistance that we are meeting when it comes to going forward and hitting speeds and trying to achieve our goals, and that rider position has to be kind of prioritized above equipment. But we know the role that equipment plays as well. All right, so we've spoken a lot about different elements of bike fit, and I think my parting message would be to riders that when you seek a bike fit and when you want to achieve good outcomes from a bike fit, you need to work with somebody who will develop that relationship with you and will go on that roadmap with you. And as I've explained, it starts with the baseline. It starts with establishing what you've currently been doing. Then it moves to evaluating what opportunities you have, both in equipment and based on your flexibility and your kind of willingness to evolve your position. And after that, it becomes a sequence of quality trials where you integrate the changes into your training, and that's done at race intensities, or it's done at distances that you're trying to cover, or it's done at durations. And from that, you take that measured feedback, it's more qualified feedback, you take it back to the fitter that you're working with, and you begin to layer upon that. And that will be the way that we approach bike fit at IOG, and it will be the way that I would encourage anybody watching this video to approach their evolution in their position. So we'll be happy to help any riders with their questions. They can contact us directly through our website at ivano'gorman.com. We have a couple of locations in the US, and we do a lot of remote bike fitting as well. So please go to our site, check out our information. If that doesn't satisfy you, have any questions, we'd love to hear from you, and look forward to working with you in the future.